Are there mistakes in Drive to Survive? Absolutely.
You must be aware of the criticism around the fakeness of Drive to Survive.
Ooh, God, you're going to get me into trouble.
Do you really care what F1 drivers think?
Well,
We're asking a Drive to Survive co-executive producer all the questions that you want answering. And their name is Tom as well. So it's P1 with Matt, Tom and Tom. Tom Rogers, how are you, my friend? You good?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good to be here. I'm looking forward to this. I'm a fan of the podcast, so it's nice to be on it.
Okay, so of course Drive to Survive Season 7 is out now. We've watched it. We've dived deep into it. I guess the first thing to ask you, Tom, is that you probably weren't short of content for this year.
Yeah, I think Season 7 was the opposite problem to Season 6. You know, Season 6, we came off this season of racing where Red Bull had won all but one race, you know, and the commission's the same every year, 10 EPs, and, you know, that we have to admit, I think Season 6 was a bit of a challenge, and yeah, Season 7, completely the opposite end of the spectrum. In many respects, too much happened, and stuff, you know, went to the end of the season as well. You know, the championship not being decided until the final race. You know, this is great for race fans, but a real challenge for Drive to Survive when we've got to get this thing edited, delivered, posted, you know, translated into how many languages for Netflix, and then up on service before we go racing again. So yeah, it was a busy year.
I bet, yeah. Do you have a favourite episode or moment from the new season that really stands out to you?
I always really like it when we kind of break the fourth wall and when people reference the show. There's a little moment in the Toto, when Toto's in interview and he's talking about Lewis leaving, and he starts kind of messing with his eye, and then he says, I bet you're going to put this in and pretend that I was crying. And I always I always really like those moments because they kind of poke fun at the show, which, you know, we can't take it too seriously. It's supposed to be a fun show about an amazing sport, and, you know, I think if you take everything too seriously, then it can be pretty depressing. So those moments I always really like, you know, where people kind of reference the show and kind of pull at the thread of how it's put together.
Next question comes in from P1 Patreon member Scones Text Murder. How far ahead do you decide what storylines to develop, and how much wiggle room is there for when things don't follow the narrative you hope to include?
Yes, it's a good question because you obviously go into a season with a plan. You know, at the moment we've got, you know, there's 10 episodes to every season, so you have to have a rough idea of, okay, these are the storylines we think are going to pay off. You know, and obviously Lewis at Ferrari, we knew that was going to be a story. Haas after Gunter, we knew was going to be a story. But there's so many unknown curveballs that come up during the year that if you just sort of decided what the stories were going to be and didn't pivot, you would miss 90% of what actually happens, you know.
Yeah, that's it's not set in stone, is it, at any point? And I think that's the key thing there. I'm going to ask this next question, Tommy. I think you were going to, but it's about Leclerc. So why on earth would I not ask this question? It's ridiculous.
Go for it.
Of course, there was an amazing episode about Charles Leclerc winning at Monaco, breaking the curse and things like that. If he didn't win that race, would you have canned the entire episode for when he did win it in the future?
Well, you know, it would have remained the curse of Leclerc, wouldn't it? So I don't know. Like, I think that, by the way, is one of our better titles this year. I think Le Curse of Leclerc. I know the title. You know, you think the show splits opinion. The titles have a whole sort of. I think they have a whole subreddit on, you know, kind of people's opinions on those. You know, in all honesty, I don't know, because it might have been quite interesting to show that sort of POV of him still not managing it. The problem is that story had kind of been told before. You know, we've been with Charles when Monaco hasn't gone very well. So yeah, probably the reality is if he hadn't won, then probably there wouldn't have been enough to make that sort of solo piece about him. We probably would have had to think about something else.
So when you saw that red flag come out, you were like, done and dusted. The episode's in the bag. No pit stops. It's over.
Yeah, but do you know what? The red flag coming out was actually pretty bad news, because he'd maintained the lead in that first start And he talks about that, he's like, yeah, I've sort of done it. And then the red flag comes down. He's like, oh, God, I've got to do it all again. I've got to do another start, and there's that sort of risk that goes with it.
This one is from Flesser. How many hours of material do you actually make during a season? And I guess how much is then cut out? If you're constantly, thinking on your feet and changing things, there must be an awful lot.
Yeah, there is. And I think that's a blessing and a curse in many respects, because so we have a varying number of crews at every Grand Prix. We're at every Grand Prix, but the scale of that varies quite dramatically. Sometimes we'll have, maybe one camera, and they're only there just in case something crazy happens, and we kind of need to react to it. And then some Grand Prix, we know that there's going to be some sort of story payoff or something going to happen in that Grand Prix that makes it a larger feature for us. So we can have 5 or 6 crews kind of around the paddock, and obviously those races you have a lot more latitude to kind of adapt to what happens. I did a chat with Formula One last week, and they've put an article up, and I think they sort of estimate in 7 years of Drive to Survive as about 10,000 hours of footage. And then in addition to that, we get every single camera that Formula One operate, and that's a sort of crazy amount of media. They have, I think it's 24 cameras around the track. There's 80 onboard cameras. There's a helicopter. There's about 6 or 7 cameras that roam around the paddock. There's GoPros. There's like all sorts of stuff, and that comes to us after every race, and it's an enormous sort of game of find the needle in the haystack. And it's a massive team on our side that comb through that stuff, but it is an extraordinary effort, especially when you have this nuts schedule that we have, where the show has to be on service before the next season of racing starts. And because Formula One's so popular, they keep adding races, and it keeps making it even harder for all of us. So yeah, it's a massive challenge.
We just discussed actually about kind of our favourite moments in the previous season, and one of the ones that I mentioned that really sort of like I thought was really cool in the first season, the first episode of the new season was when Carlos and Lewis are having a chat in the press conference, sort of like whispering to each other. So do you have access to those microphones and all those kind of, I guess, that doesn't go out to the press that are sat there in the interview room, but you get to hear all those kind of like little whispers that they're talking to
so
about.
it's a variety of things. So obviously there's microphones that they use for the press conferences and things like that, but we also have our own amazingly talented team of sound recordists who
following with a boom mic everywhere to get everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. They've become iconic. Before Drive to Survive, nobody had ever seen a boom mic in the paddock, and now, as soon as they see it, I remember watching. There's a brilliant YouTube video of like who's got the longest boom in the paddock, and like that video gets circulated amongst the crew because you're sort of laughing about which soundy is it that's got some enormous boom pole trying to sort of drop into a conversation. But yeah, we use radio mics, we use sort of ambient mics in certain areas. There's microphones on our cameras. Obviously, there's a massive sort of plethora of microphones and techniques that the soundies use to capture those little moments, because I think that's the sort of stuff that's always elevated Drive to Survive outside the norm. If you look back at season 1 of Drive to Survive, Gunter becoming an absolute icon in the we could have been rock stars, but now we look like a bunch of wickers. Like that moment.
That is the moment, isn't it? Yeah.
And that was entirely caught on a radio mic that he was wearing, and he took a phone call and was chatting to Gene on the phone, and all of those moments of that the sort of hygiene, the kind of iconic sort of phrase that Gunter will always be known by now. Hygiene. Most of those are sound with no pictures. There's shots of a closed door, and it's the sound that actually gives you that privileged access. And I think that's where having that sensitivity to sort of capturing sound from day one has been massively important to the show.
It's interesting you mentioned about capturing these sneaky moments. A question from Shady Sir: have there ever been any things that were in the final cut of Drive to Survive, but a team or driver asked you to remove it?
Well, the teams don't have editorial control, and I think that's a big departure for them. That requires an enormous amount of trust on their part and participation and collaboration. There's things that we show that are incredibly sensitive moments, and we don't want to do that without the team or the driver or being supportive of why we're doing that. A great example this year would be George Russell after the Singapore Grand Prix is pretty unwell after being in that car overheating for the full duration of the Grand Prix, and he needs some medical attention, and that clip obviously is pretty intense, and we've included that in collaboration with Mercedes and George and everybody that was involved, because it's important to us that if we're going to show something like that, everybody supports it and everybody's on board with it. There's also stuff that we capture naturally that is commercially sensitive, and that's one area that we just have to be very careful of. Is like sometimes we'll overhear contract negotiations that people don't even know are happening, and so we have to be very careful of that, because what we can't do is obviously commercially damage any of the teams or the sport or anything like that. So again, there's certain things that teams wouldn't want in the public domain just because it might give a competitor a commercial advantage. And it's the same with, we have a privileged position inside the garages with these cars, and sometimes all the bodywork's off and our guys are filming, and then it's only when you show that footage to the team as part of that review process towards the end, they go, oh my god, that's a really confidential bit of brake duct which none of us would ever have known. That needs to be blurred, or can you use a different shot? Because if such a body sees that, they'll nick our design. And so there is an element of that process. But in terms of like veto rights, they don't veto, they can't sort of ask for stuff to be removed on editorial grounds.
Okay, that's really interesting, actually, because like hearing about the George Russell clip, for example, and the fact that the team and himself is happy to show that clip, because you say it is intense. But yeah, it makes sense as well from your perspective that if you start showing things that teams are absolutely not happy about, everyone closes up, and then we get a series that doesn't show what we want to see. So it must be such a fine line to balance on.
It is, and I think it's about making sure everybody understands like what we're trying to do, like what we're trying to achieve, and I think this is where maybe some of that kind of Marmite element, comes in, where some people love Drive to Survive, some people really don't. And I think it's because of the fact that, what we're trying to do for Formula One isn't necessarily what some, purist racing fans want to happen to their sport. I think we're trying to open the door and bring in a whole new raft of fans. I think I'm incredibly proud when I go to Grand Prix now. I was at Silverstone this summer to see so many more kids, so many more women, like such a bit, a much broader spectrum of audience going to Grand Prix and watching Grand Prix.
This one's from Ghost of Indy 2005. Have the Netflix crew been following a driver or team and filmed a situation that they realised they really shouldn't have?
We felt that in season 3 with the Romain Grosjean crash. I think, anybody that was in Bahrain for that crash, it etched in their mind as it was pretty horrendous. I wasn't in the paddock for that race, but obviously we had an enormous number of crew there, and I've spoken to a lot of them sort of subsequently about it. And it was horrendous, because genuinely I think most people thought there's no way he's getting out of that car. Like, how is it possible that he gets out of that? And obviously the instincts for Formula One is they cut the TV feeds, the cameras sort of come away, they're not covering it, so nobody really knows what's going on. And I think we knew we had to keep filming, and then obviously we kind of deal with it afterwards. And we were very, very careful to make sure that if we told that story, we told it with the blessing of Romain, with the Haas team. We also wanted to shine a light on the unbelievable work of like the FIA stewards in that incident, and obviously the medical car, who were actually responsible for kind of pulling him out. And so I think you keep filming, because that's what you do as if you're making sort of documentary content. You keep filming, and then you sort of figure it out afterwards. But I think if Roman had been very vehemently against telling that story, then of course we would have respected that, because it was such a harrowing moment.
Next question, and this one I guess is quite a widely spoken about one. You must be aware of the criticism around the fakeness of Drive to Survive from F1 fans and drivers. How would you respond to people that dismiss the series and just think it's all fake and scripted drama?
I think that's a real shame when people kind of write it off with a big sort of blanket term like that. Obviously, it's more nuanced than that. Are there mistakes in Drive to Survive? Absolutely. There's loads of them. This show is so challenging to make. I think people think that we basically kind of chill and that the show makes itself. Like, it is the biggest, most complicated, heavy lift of a show to get done every year. We have an amazing team. There's about 160 people that work on the show. An enormous team at the edit who work through Christmas, through New Year. Basically Christmas is cancelled every year for those that are working on Drive to Survive. It's a massive push to get it to the finish line, and as a result of that, do mistakes happen? Absolutely. There's a mistake sort of doing the rounds this year. A couple of rogue shots that the conspiracy theorists like to think it was a massive intentional stitch-up job. The reality is, 2 shots look quite similar. People are wearing the same clothes in both, and there's a mistake. And I think when we spot things like that are kind of just innocent mistakes, we rectify them where we can. And some of the continuity stuff that people like to point out, it is just the nature of making a really complicated show like this.
Tom, to be honest, I won't forgive you and the entire team for the fact that Charles Leclerc was starting the Monaco Grand Prix on hard tyres. It honestly shocked me to my core.
Yes. It's shots like that are a challenge, and I think, to be honest with you, that's what we know that's what winds the purists up. It's stuff like that. But I think the reality is we need to remember what the show is for. The show isn't a highlight show. The show isn't a in-depth technical analysis of a race season, because people like you guys do an amazing job of analysing the actual racing, and even the broadcast partners around the world. If you want to know about tyre strategy, engines, aerodynamics, Sky do a great job of talking about that. That's not what Drive to Survive is for. Drive to Survive is there to appeal to a broader audience and actually to kind of shine a light on the human stories that make up Formula One. And I think Drive to Survive is the better for having people working on it that aren't necessarily Formula One purists, because they go where the story goes and they tell stories that people can identify with. The trade-off with that is sometimes people don't realise that, oh crap, that's a hard tyre and that shouldn't be on that car at that particular moment, and do we have an alternative shot for that? And if we'd spotted it, then of course we would have used the right shot. So it's difficult. I think the thing that's sad for me, and I see it a lot, and I see this in some of the mainstream journalists, will write articles saying why they don't like Drive to Survive, and then in the article they say, oh, I only watched season 1, I haven't watched it since. And you're like, well,
yeah.
Maybe watch all of it, and then if you watch it and you don't like it, fine, that's free will. That's the whole point of watching shows. I watch stuff that I don't like, I watch stuff that I do like. It's not the end of the world, but I think writing it off completely from a starting point, without kind of appreciating what it's there for, is a shame. Because I think, even if you don't like some of the stuff that is in it, there's still moments in there that I think anybody can find interesting or insightful, or can give you a fresh view on a particular situation.
We obviously bantered about the whole Charles Leclerc was on hard tyres at this point. Do you feel like it's something that, if I take my Formula One nerd hat off and the challenge of essentially like a Formula One fan like us, we know every single bit of context about that race, and you're kind of having to cover almost like a 70-lap Grand Prix in a 5-minute segment, or sometimes even 40 seconds or something, that that you kind of have to like piece bits together to almost kind of make the whole thing make sense, because there are people that are watching the sport, watching Drive to Survive, that don't have a clue and need that context and need kind of things happening all the time.
Yeah, I think, whenever you distill a super complicated 2-hour race into 5 minutes, you are invariably going to have to make some decisions as to what you do and don't show. And ultimately, Drive to Survive is an entertainment show. It's there to entertain an audience. It isn't a very straight BBC style documentary series. Like that's not its MO. Like it's designed to entertain people, make people interested in the sport, and ultimately make people want to watch. Because if we edited these races together and it was just a load of onboards of Max 20 seconds ahead of everyone else having a pretty
Tommy would love that. Tommy would laugh that.
It'd probably be a whole new subset of audience that we'd engage with there. But I think it's a challenge. I don't think you could probably win whichever way you go with Drive to Survive. There's always going to be a group of people that aren't happy. Whether that's people that want a more purist telling of race stories, or people that are actually there because they like the entertainment genre and they kind of want that style of show. And I think we try to find the middle ground. And the reality is, like I said, the schedule's so crazy. We're editing 10 episodes all at the same time. You can't really lock anything until the season's over. We work with our amazing partners at Netflix, some of whom are based in LA. So quite often we're doing viewings in the nighttime UK time to work with time zones. Everybody's exhausted, and so a random shot that accidentally slips through, you can kind of see how it happens. It's funny though, like there's a whole a group of audience that don't watch the sport because they don't want spoilers for Drive to Survive. Which to me, I was like, my mind was completely blown when somebody told me that. Mad. And it's like, wow, okay, right. I'm not entirely sure that was the intention when we started making Drive to Survive, but that shows you the breadth of people that watch the show. Like there is genuinely people that just tune into Drive to Survive because they like that show, in the same way as they'll tune into Squid Game or whatever other Netflix show it is they love.
So obviously Max Verstappen is probably the main one, but other drivers have also been kind of critical of the series in the past. Do you really care what F1 drivers think, or is it more about just kind of making it good for the audience? Like how do you kind of balance that side of it when maybe a Formula One driver is being so critical?
Yeah, I think obviously it's a shame when there's issues with teams or drivers or anything like that. I think also we should be mindful of the fact that these things always get kind of blown out of proportion. It becomes this sort of media echo chamber where one quote gets
on the internet,
in the article,
and
then 1,000 different newspapers are actually just quoting that original article, and it just becomes this sort of snowball. And I think, as you can see, we've filmed in and around Max at Grand Prix, and Red Bull are a very sort of prominent part of the show, and and I think, listen, Max had his opinions on the early seasons, and we spoke to him about that. That's been pretty widely reported, and and my hope is that everybody can work collaboratively, because I do genuinely believe that a successful Drive to Survive benefits everybody, because the increased interest in the sport, the increased social media followers that everybody kind of gets off the back of a Drive to Survive launch ultimately brings sponsors to the sport. It's bringing an 11th team to the sport from 2026. That's a sign of a sport that's in rude health, and that's not to say that either side is right or wrong. I think it's just about it can be mutually beneficial for us all to have a successful Drive to Survive, and everything else. Like you look at there's movies being made about Formula One at the moment. There's other documentaries. There's the fact that the US viewership is doing so well. Like that's great news for everybody. that's involved in Formula One. Drivers, teams, us, you guys. It's the same for all of us, really.
Ludicrous Chaos asks, who is or / was the best driver to talk to, and also the most difficult driver to talk to?
Ooh, God, you're going to get me into trouble. Do you know what? I think best driver to. I think we'd be remiss to say to not say that Daniel Ricciardo is a massive favourite of the show, and our founders, Paul Martin and James Gay Rees, who are our exec producers, and they've sort of led the company and they're the kind of figureheads of all of this. Paul in interview has spoken about Danny. And the fact that really the show probably wouldn't have survived to the point that it has without Danny. And, he opened season 1 at 1 for us, and his mum, and that kind of Australian Grand Prix and the kind of emotion from her about watching him race and the dangers of it. And, I think we owe him a massive sort of debt of gratitude for his sort of continued support over 7 years. And I think the same can be said for Gunter. Gunter obviously sort of very open book, just said it how it was. Still claims to have not watched the show, which rubbish. I think is actually
rubbish.
Yeah, you do wonder. I think his wife and daughter do, but he still claims not to watch it. And but in many respects, like I kind of want that to be true, because I think that's why he then didn't change. He was still the same Gunter in season 6 that he was in season 1. I think difficult driver. To be honest with you, it depends kind of what's going on. Like, if they're coming off the back of a really tricky moment, like, anybody has the potential to be difficult. I don't think there's like one driver that's consistently difficult. I think it's a case of, if things aren't, they're incredibly competitive people, and if it's not going their way or they're frustrated at something that's, then obviously, that permeates everything they do. And I think that's also an interesting trait. You could, in many respects, in interview, by refusing to answer a question, you can say more about that topic than if you'd actually answered it.
So you say about off the back of bad results and things like that. How often do you talk to the drivers? Like, what's the amount across the whole year that you'll speak to each individual one? Do you kind of heavily weigh towards the Landos of this world, or how does that kind of work?
Well, we obviously have very close relationships with the teams, the drivers. There's a lot of continuity in our crew as well, because what Box to Box is famous for is delivering kind of top class access. Like, access is sort of what we've built our entire identity on, and in essence, Drive to Survive is 10 access projects running simultaneously 24/7 every year. Because that ongoing access conversation with teams and then drivers and everyone else is constantly ongoing. And then interviews, we tend to do a lot of interviews during race kind of weeks, weekends, things like that. Set up anywhere in the world to kind of shoot those interviews and work around them. But it is a constant collaboration.
We spoke about this in our review, but there were kind of moments like, let's say a couple of examples, Ollie Behrman, stepping in and doing an amazing job in the Ferrari, and then the other one being George disqualified at Spa. From your perspective, we tried to kind of explain it from your perspective, but you're here now, so you can kind of maybe shine a light on why aren't these moments included?
George was disqualified from Belgium.
Wait, let me get back.
Oh, hang on a minute. How did we miss that one? I think, listen, the George one's quite an easy one to address, because for us, that race was not about the eventual classified race result. That race was about George taking control of the decision making of that team. And that was the first time really that we'd see, the team wanted him to pit, they wanted him to put new tyres on, they wanted to do all of this stuff, and George took the responsibility for that race and said, no, I think I can make it to the end on these tyres. That's what was important to us there, because that was him showing number one driver mentality properly, and actually giving the insight that he could run that team. He could take that step and be a number one, and therefore Toto didn't need to look for a number one to replace Lewis because he sort of had one, a homegrown one in George. The fact
That's
that
exactly
he was
what
then,
we said.
Yeah, we've nailed it.
so the fact that he was, the fact he was then disqualified for something to do with weight and he's just like, oh my goodness me, like with that, the team made a mistake, which ultimately led to him being disqualified. It doesn't take away from the fact that George's decision making in that Grand Prix was the mark of a future leader. So that for me, that's quite a straightforward one. The Ollie one's sort of more interesting because we have this a lot in Drive to Survive. There's so many amazing stories that you really wish you could tell. And it's not necessarily that we don't have footage, because we actually do have footage of the sort of Ollie stuff. But you can't start a story you then can't pay off in a way that's like fulfilling. And I think the Ollie story would have felt like kind of half a story if it had been included in season 7. The beauty of Drive to Survive is that, we're not restricted into only telling stories from that 1 year. So this is not to say that a future episode of Ollie Behrman won't go back and look at that. How did he get his seat? Why is he in the sport this year? Like, there's a load of story there that could be used to kind of tell how he's ended up in this situation. So, I think just because you haven't seen it in season 7 doesn't mean you'll never see it. The reality is, if we showed in a season like the one we've just had, if we showed every single interesting storyline that happened, we'd need 20 episodes and we'd never finish it.
50 episodes based on last year.
I know, yeah.
Is that my next question? When are there going to be 20 episodes? And final question is from P1 Patreon member Muscles and Raccoons. You seem to have a winning formula for each season of Drive to Survive, but is there something you want to do differently next season?
I think, interestingly, the Singapore episode that you spoke about is an example of that kind of innovation that we're constantly looking at. I think that episode is a real departure from the sort of norm. And again, if you think 8 years ago before Drive to Survive, can you imagine even thinking that drivers would film themselves for a series of some description, and would open up access to that extent? That it would be completely sort of unbelievable to even conceive. And that required that commitment from those drivers that were filming and in that slightly more unfiltered way. And of course, we're thinking about, what future innovations we could implement. How do we do things differently? How do we keep freshening things up? And that's why making shows like this is really exciting, because, hand on heart, it kind of comes back to one of the earlier questions of how much do you plan ahead and how much do you pivot? Well, the reality is we're looking at a whole race season here where who knows what's going to happen. And that's what makes it interesting and exciting for us all.
Awesome. Well, that concludes quite a long podcast. Thank you so much, Tom, for coming on.
You'll have to tell me how many people have dropped off halfway through.
No, I've found it truly, it's so insightful, especially off the back of just watching the latest season. So thank you so much for being so open about it all. It's been really awesome to have you on, and we can't wait, I think, for the next however many seasons will be coming. Fingers crossed this season looks like you'll have your work cut out. So I'm sorry for, wishing a few more grey hairs for you, but also I think hopefully season 8 will be even bigger.
Yeah, I think, listen, like, obviously there's nothing sort of official yet in terms of season 8, but, we're hopeful that it'll continue, for many years to come, because there's obviously compelling narratives there. So fingers crossed I'll be back talking to you guys in a year's time about another series.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. We'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye.